If every time you say, I take responsibility, you feel the urge to punish yourself, that's not responsibility. That's self-destruction disguised as maturity. Most people believe that being responsible means blaming yourself, enduring in silence, shrinking, and carrying guilt. But be honest with yourself. Does your life actually become better from constant self-blame? Or have you simply learned to live under inner pressure and call it being an adult? Here is the hook that changes everything. True responsibility never destroys a person. If it leaves you feeling ashamed, afraid, or wanting to disappear, then you have confused responsibility with self-punishment. Today, we're going to talk about how to take responsibility for your life without breaking yourself, how to step out of the inner courtroom, and how to move from I am guilty to I choose. Because maturity is not about suffering correctly, it's about seeing clearly, understanding deeply, and acting without being at war with yourself. In this video, we're going to talk about responsibility, but not the kind that destroys you from the inside. You'll learn how to take responsibility for your life without guilt, self-blame, or self-punishment. We'll break down what real responsibility actually is, where toxic self-blame comes from, how it forms in childhood, and how to replace it with a mature, grounded way of taking ownership. And if you watch until the end, you'll learn a simple but powerful shift that helps you stop turning every mistake into self-attack and start turning it into clarity and choice. 1. What responsibility really is. Responsibility is a word we hear from childhood. Parents, teachers, mentors, coaches, they all repeat, be responsible. We learn that being responsible means doing everything right, controlling ourselves, not making mistakes. Over time, many start to believe that responsibility is about suffering, blaming yourself, working too hard, and carrying stress inside. But that is not true. Real responsibility is not punishment, self-criticism, or guilt. True responsibility is the ability to see, understand, and choose, not just react or follow rules. It expands a person, makes them stronger and freer. Guilt, on the other hand, constricts, destroys, and keeps us trapped in the past. Here's a story from my life. When I was a teenager, my grandfather often took me fishing. He was a man of his word and actions, respected in the village, but most importantly, he had a way of teaching simple truths that stayed in your heart forever. One morning, while we were preparing the boat, I accidentally dropped the tackle box into the water. My hands were shaking, my heart racing. I braced myself for punishment, scolding, the usual. You should have been more careful. But my grandfather looked at me calmly, almost smiling. See what happened. The box is in the water. What can we do now? Instead of scolding me, he asked me to think, how can we save the tackle? How can we prepare better next time? How can we make sure this doesn't happen again? I remember that lesson to this day. Responsibility is not about fearing mistakes or blaming yourself. Responsibility is about seeing the consequences of your actions and choosing what to do next. Since then, I've noticed that people who live in constant stress over responsibility confuse it with self-punishment. They constantly say, I must, I'm guilty, I'm bad if something goes wrong. In reality, this is just an old inner voice from childhood, when even small mistakes were met with scolding, silence, or shame. Real responsibility shows up differently. You can make mistakes but not lose yourself. You can make decisions without emotionally destroying yourself. You see the consequences and choose actions instead of getting stuck in guilt. And one more key point, responsibility is a way to expand your boundaries, not limit yourself. When you act consciously, your strength and freedom grow. Guilt and self-punishment do the opposite. They shrink the soul and block growth. If every time you say, I am responsible, it feels heavy or makes you want to punish yourself, that is not responsibility. It's an old pattern that can be changed. True responsibility is gentle, clear, and conscious. It doesn't destroy, it supports. It doesn't make you afraid, it helps you act. Many people think that guilt and self-punishment are personal weaknesses or flaws in character. In reality, self-destructive responsibility almost always has its roots in childhood. When we grow up, our emotions and reactions are shaped not only by experiences, but also by how the adults around us respond. If a child is punished, ignored, or shamed for even the smallest mistakes, they gradually learn to turn responsibility into an inner war with themselves. As a result, even as adults, such people tend to blame themselves for everything, overload themselves with tasks, constantly seek validation of their worth through results, believe that love and acceptance depend on their perfect behavior. When I was a teenager, my older friend Lizzie always tried to be perfect. She helped her parents, got top grades, and participated in every school project. But even the smallest mistakes at home or at school were met with harsh criticism. Sometimes her family simply ignored her feelings as if saying, "It's your fault. You don't deserve attention." Over time, Lizzie learned to take responsibility for everything, even for things beyond her control. She would wake up early, complete countless tasks, worry about other people's mistakes, and felt that if she failed somewhere, the love and attention of those around her would disappear. I remember one incident. Lizzie accidentally spilled juice on a school project we were preparing together. She immediately panicked, started scolding herself, and apologized to everyone around. I noticed for the first time that her reaction was completely out of proportion. Her responsibility had become toxic and self-destructive. As she got older, Lizzie told me how this affected her life. She was afraid to make decisions, often burned out at work and in relationships, and constantly felt an inner fear of not being enough. Toxic responsibility is not a personal weakness. It's an internal pattern formed in childhood, where love and acceptance depended on behavior. To change this pattern, you need to understand its roots and learn consciously to take responsibility without self-punishment, separating mistakes from your inherent worth. 3. What toxic responsibility looks like in adult life. Toxic self-destructive responsibility is when a person carries childhood patterns into adulthood. They feel that they must take responsibility for everything, even for things beyond their control, even for other people's mistakes. The result is constant inner tension, burnout, anxiety, and a persistent feeling of, "I'm not enough." A person with toxic responsibility often takes on other people's problems, blames themselves for others' mistakes, struggles to rest or allow themselves pleasure, constantly seeks validation of their worth through results. Once, my friend Emily, already a young adult, started her first serious job. She was diligent, responsible, and always tried to do more than expected, but any small mistake caused panic. She lost sleep, blamed herself, and felt like a bad employee. One day, a colleague forgot to close the storage room door, and part of the inventory was damaged. Emily immediately felt it was her fault, even though it was completely out of her control. She spent the entire day worrying about how to fix the situation, trying to take responsibility for someone else's mistake. Her manager noticed her stress and approached her. "Emily, this is not your fault. You're doing everything right." Only then did Emily realize that her habit of taking everything on herself was a childhood pattern, where even a small mistake felt like a threat, fear of punishment or losing approval. Toxic responsibility destroys inner harmony. A person constantly battles with themselves instead of acting calmly and consciously. It often shows up in relationships. When a partner makes a mistake, someone with toxic responsibility feels they must fix everything themselves. At work, they take on other people's tasks. In family life, they try to control everything and everyone. Adult life is not about punishing yourself for every mistake. True responsibility is the ability to distinguish what is truly within your sphere of influence and what is not. Knowing your boundaries preserves your energy, calm, and sanity. If a person doesn't realize this, they continue living in a childhood pattern where any mistake feels like a threat to their existence. Mature responsibility is not control over everything, but the ability to see, understand, and act without self-destruction. Notice when you take on other people's problems. Ask yourself, is this really my responsibility or not? Learn to distinguish responsibility for your own actions, responsibility for everything. 4. Mature responsibility, a different inner foundation. Mature responsibility is the ability of an adult to see the consequences of their actions, accept them, and act consciously without destroying themselves emotionally. This is a completely different level from toxic, self-punishing responsibility. In childhood, responsibility is often experienced as obligation or punishment, but an adult understands something deeper. Responsibility is a choice. We are not required to suffer in order to be good or worthy. We can take responsibility for our actions with clarity, without excessive guilt, and without inner conflict. When I once worked with a young team on a project, one of the team members, James, made a serious mistake in a report. Many people would immediately blame themselves or panic, but James responded differently. He came to me calmly and explained what had happened, what consequences it might have, and what he proposed to do to fix the situation. He said, "I understand what happened. I take responsibility for it, and here is how I suggest we move forward." I was struck by his calmness. He didn't punish himself, didn't look for excuses, and didn't shift blame onto others. He simply saw the problem and chose how to solve it. This is what mature responsibility looks like. It shows not in words, but in actions, in how a person reacts, what decisions they make, and how they maintain inner balance. Key signs of mature responsibility. A person sees the consequences of their actions without self-condemnation. Mistakes do not turn into self-punishment. Decisions are made with clarity and confidence. The person separates themselves from their actions. An action is not the same as identity. A philosophical reflection. Mature responsibility is an inner point of support. It does not depend on external approval, circumstances, or perfection. It allows a person to be strong, flexible, and free. When a mistake happens, ask yourself, what can I do now to improve the situation? Notice that self-blame is not required to move forward. Separate your actions from who you are. This will help you build healthier relationships, work more effectively, and maintain inner peace. 5. Where responsibility ends. What is yours and what is not? One of the most subtle and essential abilities of a mature person is the ability to recognize the boundaries of responsibility. This is exactly where inner breakdowns often happen, because many people carry not only their own responsibilities, but also those of others. Other people's emotions, expectations, decisions, mistakes, and even their destinies. In childhood, many of us were taught, be good, don't upset anyone. You should understand. Because of you, I feel bad. Over time, this creates a deep belief. If someone near me is suffering, it must be my fault, and I must fix it. In adulthood, this turns into constant inner tension. A person lives with the feeling that they always owe something. To keep peace in the family, to smooth conflicts, to save a partner, to hold relationships together, to be strong even when they themselves are breaking. But the truth is this: responsibility is not control over other people's feelings or choices. Responsibility is honesty with yourself. I once knew a woman named Sarah. She was deeply caring, thoughtful, and emotionally attentive to others. Many people came to her for support, advice, and comfort. She knew how to listen and always tried to help. One day, she said something that stayed with me. I'm tired of living as if I'm responsible for everyone's happiness except my own. For many years, Sarah was in a relationship where her partner constantly placed his struggles on her shoulders. If he had a bad day, she blamed herself. If he was unhappy, she searched for what she had done wrong. If he wasn't fulfilled, she tried to inspire, support, and save him. Only when she reached emotional exhaustion did she ask herself one simple but frighteningly honest question: where am I in this life? That moment changed everything. She realized she could be present and supportive, but she was not required to live someone else's life for them. She had the right to take responsibility only for her own decisions, reactions, and boundaries. A deeper understanding. When you take responsibility for other people's emotions and choices, you rob them of the opportunity to grow, and you rob yourself of the opportunity to live. Mature responsibility sounds like this: I am responsible for my actions. I am not responsible for how others react. I can be present without sacrificing myself. This is not cruelty. This is maturity. Boundaries of responsibility are an act of self-respect and respect for others. As long as you carry someone else's life on your shoulders, you are not living your own, and only where toxic responsibility ends does true freedom begin. If you feel overwhelmed, ask yourself, is this truly mine? Or am I carrying something that isn't? If guilt arises, check whether you have taken responsibility for something that does not belong to you. Remember, you do not have to be everything for everyone in order to be worthy. 6. Responsibility as freedom, not a burden. At the most mature level, responsibility stops feeling like a heavy weight. It no longer sounds like, I must, I'm obligated, I'm not allowed to make mistakes. Instead, it begins to sound like, I choose. This is the point of inner freedom. When a person moves from toxic responsibility through awareness of childhood patterns, through boundaries and maturity, they arrive at a simple yet powerful understanding. I am not responsible for the entire world. I am responsible for the direction of my life. Responsibility becomes a burden only when it is rooted in fear. Fear of rejection, fear of losing love, fear of being not enough. But when responsibility is grounded in choice, it stops destroying. It becomes a source of strength. I once had a conversation with an elderly woman. We spoke about life, decisions, and regrets. She said a sentence I will never forget. I became truly free only when I stopped living from fear and started living from responsibility for myself. She didn't blame her parents' fate or circumstances, and she didn't blame herself either. She simply accepted one truth. I can't change the past, but I can be honest in the present. There was no pain in her voice, only calm, the essence of mature responsibility. It is not punishment for mistakes. It is not control over everything and everyone. It is not self-sacrifice. It is the ability to say, yes, this is my life, and I choose how I live it. When responsibility becomes conscious, it stops being heavy. It turns into support. You no longer live in reaction to other people's expectations. You live from your inner truth, and even mistakes stop being enemies. They become teachers. If you feel heaviness, you may be carrying what is not yours. If you feel clarity, you are within your responsibility. And if you choose yourself without self-destruction, that is maturity. If we gather everything we've talked about today into one essence, it would sound like this. Responsibility is not a punishment, it is a form of freedom. We begin life with childhood patterns. We learn to be good, to avoid mistakes, to earn love, and not to disappoint. Very often, it is there, in childhood, that responsibility becomes connected to fear. The fear of rejection, of being unloved, of not being enough. In adulthood, this fear turns into toxic responsibility. We blame ourselves for everything. We take on other people's emotions. We live in constant inner tension. We try to control what cannot be controlled. But maturity begins the moment you ask yourself an honest question. Where does my responsibility end and where does someone else's begin? You learn to recognize your patterns. You learn to separate actions from identity. You learn to acknowledge mistakes without destroying yourself. You learn to choose yourself without guilt. Mature responsibility is the ability to say, I am responsible for my life, but I do not have to suffer in order to be worthy. And in that moment, everything changes. Relationships become more honest. Work stops draining you. Your inner dialogue becomes gentler. and life feels calmer and clearer. You no longer live from fear, you live from choice. You no longer live from fear, you live from choice. And perhaps most importantly, mistakes stop being proof that something is wrong with you. They become points of growth. If you take only one idea from this video, let it be this. You can be a responsible person without destroying yourself. This is what real adult freedom looks like.